Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be back at DroidCon after a couple of years away and also back in New York, sharing a few ideas with you all about what the future of interface might look like. If you don't know me, I'm Liam. I'm a designer and design advocate on material design, so I contribute to the material design system, but I also work with a lot of designers outside Google to just improve design in our ecosystems. It's important to note today that I'm here as myself, so I'm talking about my own ideas for the future of design, not necessarily about Google's plans or products, although we will get a little bit into what Material is working on. The talk is a synthesis of a lot of things that I've been thinking about and working on over the past several years. You've probably heard me talk a lot about adaptive design over the years. If you've had coffee with me over the past 8 months, you probably heard bits and pieces of this talk already. But this is just an introduction to get us thinking about possible futures for the discipline of creating digital interfaces, whether that's design or implementation. And we're going to get pretty abstract because I think it's worth taking a step back and seeing how we got to where we are making digital interfaces and where we can go. With that out of the way, I want to start out with a few pictures. How many times have you seen one of these images that describes the experience of creating an interface? The image that probably has been the most pervasive, vacillating between ironic and earnest, is that of two ketchup bottles. On the left, there's a glass bottle that stands upright. It has a metal screw-top lid. It's the kind of bottle that you have to hit with your hand or stick a knife into. But the image implies that at least it's aesthetically nice. It stands for the type of design that's supposed to look nice, regardless of how it impacts the experience. And there's a really strong implicit value statement in the image that this bottle, which is labeled UI, is mostly concerned with visuals and nothing else. On the right, there's a plastic bottle with the lid facing down. This one squirts. Gravity helps the ketchup stay near the opening. The lid is even bigger for better balance. Ostensibly, given the label UX, it's a bottle whose primary concern is the ease of use and a good experience and more ketchup. The image, of course, can't illustrate that this bottle also has its problems. You need to shake it beforehand. It might fall over. It gets crusty around the opening. There's also the picture of a desire path, a well-trod dirt path that's cutting through the grass next to a perfectly maintained sidewalk. The sidewalk in this case is labeled design. It's again aesthetic, full of visual function and meaning, clearly representing a strong design intent. And the desire path is labeled user experience. So this image too is loaded with implicit beliefs. The desire path would tell us maybe that a designer should have made a diagonal sidewalk instead of a perpendicular one, or maybe that user experience actually means that the user is going to do whatever they want to accomplish a task, no matter how carefully we place our bricks. And finally, I'm sure this isn't the last one that comes to mind, there's the gif of the guy with a glass of water who can't seem to take a drink. It's a straightforward task, but it's made to look impossible, even though to us as viewers, the answer is right there. If we're looking at it as designers, we also see that someone has designed a glass for holding water and putting to your mouth, and we kind of give a knowing chuckle to the representation of a user who just can't figure it out. These images all feel really relatable to us at different stages of the design process, and they're good comic relief, but I think there's another common factor between them that's really interesting. They frame the intent and the context of the user as somewhat of an aberration, something that we need to work around, predict, influence, standardize, or in the worst case, ignore. And I think if images like these are any kind of touchstone for our understanding of our discipline, we can probably use them for some critical reflection as well. Especially since our work creating interfaces doesn't typically deal with things like ketchup bottles, sidewalks, or glasses of water. The technology that we're using to implement an interface is digital. And if we want to understand the possibilities that digital interface actually unlocks for us, it's worth backing up and examining how we got here, taking a much broader view of the discipline before coming back down to practical day-to-day application. So I'm going to start as broad as possible. If we're talking about digital interface, what does digital mean? In 2021's digital anthropology, digital is defined as something that can be reduced to binary code. So this definition, pointed out by the authors of the book Miller and Horst, shows that it can be thought of as an abstraction of the analog or physical world. Binary code can conceivably then be configured into anything we can imagine, but we most often encounter it as highly specific instantiations like apps. They also point out how this abstraction is not without precedent. They compare it to a similar abstraction that emerged with the invention of currency, which made the world reducible to a baseline of 10. And they say that at this earlier point of abstraction, quote, exchange became more distant and focused on equivalence rather than human and social consequence. So as currency enforced a boundary between people and products, because we were no longer making the products that we were consuming, it underscored a separation also between that production and consumption. So to bring it back to our work, with creators and users, the separation is really easy to see in the processes that we use to design and code things. So since we talked about digital, what is interface? Interface, I think, is something like a dance taking place on a point of encounter between the two planes of the material and human, or technology and human, between object and subject, between the one who's created and the one who's encountering. And design, which I think is the practice of kind of designating the shape of one of those planes from inside the other, has understood this for a long time, since way before the invention of the digital. We're creating objects that are inherently reflecting our subjectivity as people, and design reinforces that boundary between the two planes by crossing it over and over again. You can take historical examples like Marcel Breuer, who was a modernist architect. And since we're in New York, it's worth mentioning he was also the designer of the building that houses the Frick Collection on Madison. But he had a really prolific portfolio of furniture and chairs produced during his time at the Bauhaus. And chairs we understand as objects. As humans, we can bring to a chair our subjectivity, our bodies, our physical needs. Are we tired? Are we a crowd? Are we inside? Are we outside? We meet the chair with all of these things, and it, as an unchanging object, imparts its objective nature back onto us by doing things like supporting our back, or looking nice on the patio, or folding away for easy storage. And that is interface. Breuer understood this kind of dance between the subject and object for us, users, and digital products, acknowledging the notion of interface while maybe anticipating some of the possibilities that would be unlocked for us in digital production in this 1924 poster where he says that, quote, roughly translated, chair design gets better and better every year. In the end, one sits on an elastic air column. The idea that what constitutes a chair for us would become so elastic that it no longer physically exists was a funny notion when Breuer expressed it. But digital production promises the development of products that really are abstracted to this degree. Chairs that are as adaptable and easily replicated as thin air, accommodating our infinite subjectivity with a fluid range of objectivity. It's not hard to imagine how this kind of fluidity could deliver a reshaped relationship to digital products, if not also the production. It could address and maybe even correct that kind of abstract alienation between human and machine that's imparted by the abstraction of things into binary. We also understand most objects in our lives to be the process of, to be brought into the world through the process of mass production. In other words, we know that these things are lying at the end of a process of refinement as a fixed object. Mass production is the process whose origin lies near the beginning of many industrial chronologies of design, which I think is a topic worth talking about in its own right. But it functions best in continuous motion using tools and processes that are optimized for exact purposes. And it owes its speed and efficiency to the standardization of the objects it produces. And it's worth also mentioning that these qualities of mass production tie design and its rationales directly to monetary cost, not only in placing an emphasis on the process, but also reinforcing the idea that design should be correct and that a form recognizable as the final one should be attained. In order to update the material properties of, to choose a completely random object, a ketchup bottle, the production line needs new molds, new machined parts that can precisely reproduce it over and over, all things that are dictated by the updated and newly final design. The cost of these updates not only encourages opinionated and fixed designs, but it also means that design's response to consumption, the conversation between designer and consumer, is really slow. Adaptation in manufacturing as a response to externalities like material costs, consumer preferences, aesthetic trends, take a long time to implement, and one production line is not likely to produce a good number of variations in succession. The advent of digital products, on the other hand, made from binary code and electricity rather than glass and plastic, quickens the pace of the conversation significantly. The processes that create these products can do so without direct concern for the cost of materials or time that it takes to retool. The material cost of a button, for instance, doesn't really change based on the design of the button. The only further input into the system requires labor from the designer and software engineer. Moreover, digital products, no matter the intent of the designer, don't behave like machine parts. And we know this from a book by Mirka Madinow and Daniel Miller in 2012 called Migration to New Media, illustrating how a process that they call polymediation makes digital products more like an assemblage of generalized tools in our lives, taking on different subjective meanings through use in different personal and cultural contexts, rather than repetitively performing the same isolated specific task. It's unlikely for an individual component in a mass production line, for instance, to take on the same kind of social and cultural significance or designation as a digital counterpart. Consider, for example, the social significance of a belt that carries a generic cylindrical glass bottle compared to a green iMessage bubble. I think if we acknowledge the discrepancies between analog and digital modes of production, it becomes really clear that the conversation can become faster, more dimensional, and more inclusive, unbound by the historical weight and conception of design as a discipline. Digital production has an unprecedented ability to iterate on concepts, processes, and products, fine-tuning them to match the goals of creator and user within broader systems that acknowledge the fluid nature of their use. Despite this capacity, most contemporary practices rely intuitively on reflections of analog mass production. In actual practice, the conversation has gotten a bit faster, but mostly the assembly line has. And as I have since I first heard it about 8 years ago, I keep coming back to this quote from Keller Easterling when she discusses her book, Extra Statecraft, back at SPAN in 2015. You don't square up to every weed in this field with a righteous fight, you have to change something in the soil. Right now, as the people responsible for creating digital products, our collective gaze fixes on systems, standardization, and best practices to solve problems. Mass production's promise of profitability and efficiency through standardization has taught us a really distracting lesson that incentivizes systems that are only interested in consumption. Often this leads to solutions that satisfy not necessarily the user's intention, but our own. And our responses to externalities can only happen in aggregate because we're only shipping one thing at a time. The ways that we choose to describe the disciplines involved in digital production, I think, also point to a mental model that sees mass production and consumption as the primary mode of experience for which we should optimize, rather than some other facet of the human experience. User experience and user interface, for example, are terms predicated on the idea of experience through use of a thing that's already created, while interaction and product design describe the intent to optimize the reproduction of results. The organization of these disciplines, I think, exposes lack of acknowledgement for what's possible, and also some assumptions about our positionality within broader and more complex systems that I think do more to shape and mediate the experience of digital products than we do. On the other side of the digital products that we're creating stand users. And user is a term that's really common to discussions of digital interface, but I think we should also disambiguate it a bit just for the purposes of this talk, even as I know there remain questions about what it means to describe a person as a user, whether it's a useful heuristic or if it needs to be thrown out for something more humane. But in this session, we'll use the term user to stand for the colloquial understanding that a user is someone who experiences products through use and, importantly here, not through production. But I'll argue that no matter what term we use, our notions about the role of a user have to evolve to encompass more modes of experience. And I also want to point out that being a user is not a discrete task. It's really hard to compartmentalize what that means. Because in a local sense, it involves a lot of small-scale tasks like learning and keeping up with abstract patterns of touch interaction, physical actions like gesture control, and also just understanding the basic qualities and functions of the device that you're using. In a holistic view, it also involves that process of polymediation from earlier, where you have to keep up with an understanding of the whole assemblage of tools that you have, how they're related, how they're used, and how they're understood both by you and others. And that process is informed by your personal context. So being a user actually constitutes a relationship that's deeply tied to one's identity and perception, and is an ongoing, evolving process. And I also want to point out that digital production itself is abstracted. The tools that we use to both design and implement things are themselves designed and implemented. These tools place us in a relationship with our own work where we are users and ultimately have some impact on what's created. So we have to keep in mind that even as producers, we're still users of the things that are outside our own production. Marcel Breuer sat on his own chairs, sure, but he likely sat on a lot of other people's chairs too. Having set up the background, I want to get into what it might actually mean to diverge from these analog modes of production in our own work and to fully take advantage of the promises of digital production. And to start to get an idea of what that means, consider what it might be like if the people who we know as users were instead occupying a role that was more like creator. If the people who were expecting to kind of passively experience and consume a product and reproduce results could actually derive their own experiences by expressing their intention, how different could our work actually be? Architecture, the tangible outcome of which is itself a type of interface, already recognizes some of the potential we're talking about here, bringing physical products closer to a malleable, dynamic mode of experience. The removable elements like shoji panels, curtain walls, and other things that allow occupants of a space to easily reconfigure it in a way that a chair or even an app usually can't. We know that as creators of digital environments, we have an exponentially larger capacity for expressing this type of potential. An interface in actual space could be the physical contact between your body and chair that you're sitting on right now. But ours is often finger, voice, eye, and ear to device. Consider that a chair in physical space rarely learns anything from how you sit or where you want to put your feet or what you can do with your hands. One successful implementation of adaptable design based on user intent, I think, just to bring it down to something concrete, is the accelerating development behind variable type. These are fonts that are not packaged as individual styles as foundries have done for hundreds of years, but rather one program that has a full continuum of possible expressions. The product of the design process for a variable typeface does not presume to know the intent of the users who will work with it or understand it. Graphic designers and typographers are constrained only by the variables that are made available within the typeface. And when I studied at Type at Cooper here in New York, I learned from Hana Sumira that a font, the instance of the typeface that we were designing, was just one point in a multi-dimensional space called the design space. The variables in variable type, called axes, run through this conceptual space. Anywhere there's an axis, we can see a line of expression through the design space. Some axes, like weight, run straightforwardly from one point to another, for example, from thin to extra bold. Others are intersecting one another, drawing themselves into two dimensions, and still others have complex relations with one another. As one axis goes up, another one might also necessarily go up, but at a different pace. I see digital interfaces as existing within their own kind of design space, where axes like touch and visual acuity, focus, time, and others could all influence the instance of an interface that a person is presented with. Today, we're still mostly designing for these one-dimensional points of the design space rather than lines, planes, or even three-dimensional shapes. But we do have a few ways of instantiating somewhat complex axes already. A simple example is adaptation across screens. In Material, we've created guidance for adapting from screens from large to small. The screens or the breakpoints that we document there could be understood to represent individual values within one axis, in this case, screen size. But if we pause for a moment, it becomes easier to imagine moments where other axes might be running parallel nearby or intersecting with screen size in interesting ways that we should account for. For example, on a very large or small screen, we can make certain assumptions about the device to which it belongs. A screen that's TV size, for example, might actually belong to a TV, and this is information that we have access to. What then could be overlapping with screen size? Design guidance for TVs specifically draws focus to things like attentiveness. We can draw from research and from our own experience a rough knowledge of how attentive a person is when they're watching TV and create an interface that matches that attention with the right level of detail, size of components, and types of information. The way that we organize actions around that information could comprise another axis having to do with input modality. On a TV, you're likely to be using a remote control, a gamepad, or some other input device rather than directly touching the screen. These possible modalities represent stops along this other axis and will inform how the interface is ordered. How quick is it, for example, to traverse from one item to the next, or to reach a desired item from the top of the screen? These questions might have different answers on different devices or using different input modalities. Another example is in Material U, which was introduced with Android 12, and opens up the system to an unknowable form of user intent, in this case, user-selected wallpapers, which it uses to inform fundamental qualities of the interface. In this case, the color schemes of interfaces or images. In this case, the axis of color expression is populated by the HCT color space, which was created specifically for accommodating unknown user intent with perceptually consistent responses. Rather than making distinct individual choices for every color of an app's interface, the new color system is instead built around the relationships between the different elements in an interface. These relationships then absorb the intent of the designer for things like emphasis, importance, and function to apply colors, any colors, in a consistent and predictable way. The user's mental model takes shape without direct intervention from designers, and it's based on their own choices about their device. And of course, there's much more work to be done to realize a fully adaptive future at a system level. And that's whether we're talking about a design system like a Material or operating system like Android. And I think, honestly, we're talking about both. But I think the natural direction of this line of thinking is to fully realize more of these axes, seeing an individual interface as one point in a multidimensional space containing all possible interfaces for a given app, allowing an interface to function as one piece of technology that contains within it a fuller range of expressions that are directly guided by individual need and intent. I want to zoom back out for a second to understand why such a model of design might be important. A model where users are able to directly influence their own interface. And to do that, I'll talk about The Fabricant. Carrie Murphy is a co-founder of The Fabricant, which is a studio that produces virtual couture. In other words, clothing that only exists in virtual space. And when designing these garments, Murphy says that his studio uses the language of physical clothing design, but the materials are unbound by normal physical constraints. The raw materials, being digital, as we said earlier, are data. The texture, the strength, the color, weight, and dimensions of the fabric are all reducible to ones and zeros. In our discussion on design notes, Murphy also talked about his experiences creating a photorealistic avatar of himself that he could then manipulate in virtual space. He tried on challenging new garments, programmed the body to do dance moves and other movements that were heretofore impossible, and he uncovered something about the self-actualizing potential of a digital experience. The embodiment allowed him, as it allows others, to reflect on what it would be like if actual world intentions could be easily satisfied in digital space. More than that, it drew into question the subject-object relationship that Breuer and others would have assumed before the advent of digital interface. Suddenly, the will of the images being presented to Murphy was actually aligned with his own will as a subject, directly shaped by it. The conversation was finally two-sided, and both sides were agreeing. Tom Belsdorff also talks about this dynamic in his ethnographic work in virtual worlds, including in his book Coming of Age in Second Life, noting that, quote, corporations who saw Second Life as interactive misrecognized interactivity for creation. The cultural logic was not that residents interacted with a commodity and its producer, but that they literally produced what they consumed through self-actualizing acts of creation. So when we think about virtual space, the implications are pretty clear. The residents of virtual worlds exist only through their own acts of creation. Their intent for their own presentation and integration into the social milieu of virtual space is directly manifested in the world itself and the interface that governs life there. So zooming back into our work again, we have to ask, what are the implications of something like that for our work that manifests itself within the borders of screens in actual space? We can get a better understanding of digital interfaces' self-actualizing potential in our context, and what it might be like to give individuals the power to create their own experiences with our products if we consider what lies at the root of most digital interfaces today: information and action. These two things I've come to think are the building blocks of what we would now call user experience. From these primitives, we can derive components like a button. Components can afford interactions. These can also come together into UI regions. Those can comprise screens. Screens comprise flows. Flows comprise apps. You've almost certainly seen it broken down like this before, from small abstracted concepts to large practical applications, but I think it's worth repeating here. Another foundational constraint that we often acknowledge and account for is human factors. These principles, which have been variously documented by standards bodies and design practitioners, myself included, at this very conference many years ago, often appear at the bottom of a layer cake of considerations in discussions of interface design. And they are the kind of realities of the human body and cognition that impact how people can interact with the things we're making. But I think in a model organized from the principles of information and action, the human factors would actually be more like the shape of the layer cake itself. In the future presented here, I think individual intent would be a human factor that, just like touch, voice, vision, hearing, and cognition, and others, we have to be able to account for in the things that we create without precise knowledge of what it is or how it might change. In other words, if information and action are the primitives that grow into a full interface, how people choose and are able to interact with technology at that interface is a superseding layer, and I think that is where true adaptation really lives. In the more distant future, I think that interfaces we encounter will be much closer to a pure flow of this information and action, rather than being deliberately and carefully grown from primitives to entire distinct flows and interfaces. This type of interface would exist in a framework that allows it to spontaneously arise and configure itself into emergent patterns based on the intent and the subjectivity of the person using it. The interface in this model is still, of course, still our site of encounter with technology, but the dynamic between the object and subject will shift, and we'll see our own intent directly shaping the interface with which we're presented. In other words, we will finally have the equivalent of Breuer's elastic error column for every interaction that we have with every device. And it's clear that changing the way that we understand and practice our discipline will be complex. We need new technology, experimental thinking, expanded resources, new tools, and a theory of the design that reckons with our own position in the world as designers. In another interview for Design Notes, senior UX design manager Rob Giampietro underscored the gravity of our work and the importance of recognizing it, saying, quote, "You're deciding when someone should turn the page, how heavy their phone is, whether they need to swipe to get more information or they can have it right there on the screen. All of those things are ways that you're changing someone's life through design, and I don't think there could be a more transformative discipline than that." And I think transformative is an apt word here. When we design something and implement it and put it into the world, we're causing a transformation. At the surface level, we're transforming, as Rob said, someone's experience of their life. That's big enough. But we're also transforming and potentially constraining the range of possibilities and the range of possible experiences by making choices about what a product can do or can't do and how it can do it. And we're transforming ourselves as well. Our discipline often puts us, our perspectives, our experiences, our beliefs, into the world within the things that we create just by virtue of the fact that we're humans creating things for other humans. And I think that should ensure that the future of design is, in a lot of ways, still personal. Thank you all again for coming. This talk is again just an introduction, but I hope you'll follow me and check out the rest. Have a great conference.